The classroom fell silent as 23 German prisoners of war filed through the doorway of Lincoln Elementary School in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. It was a crisp October morning in 1944, and these men, still wearing their modified prison uniforms with the distinctive PW markings, had been brought here for reasons none of them fully understood. They had expected many things as prisoners in America, but standing in a bright, cheerful schoolroom filled with children's artwork and the smell of chalk dust was not among them. Obergefreiter Ernst Kaufmann pressed himself against the back wall, his eyes darting around the space with the wariness of a soldier who had learned never to relax his guard. At 26, the former infantryman from Stuttgart had survived 3 years on the Eastern Front before his unit was transferred west and subsequently captured during the Normandy breakout. He had seen things that aged men beyond their years, experienced horrors that made sleep and nightly battle. Yet nothing in his military service had prepared him for what he was about to witness in this small Midwestern American town. The room itself seemed impossible. Large windows let in streams of morning sunlight, illuminating rows of individual wooden desks, each equipped with its own chair that actually fit the student sitting in it. Kaufmann thought of the schools he had attended in Germany during the 1920s and early 1930s, where 30 or 40 students crowded onto hard wooden benches, sharing textbooks that were decades old and falling apart. Here he could see that every desk had books stacked neatly inside, and the walls were covered with colorful maps, charts showing the solar system, and examples of student work that had been carefully mounted on construction paper. The door at the front of the classroom opened, and a woman entered with an energy that seemed to light up the entire space. Miss Dorothy Henderson was 34 years old, unmarried, and had been teaching 5th grade at Lincoln Elementary for 11 years. She wore a simple navy blue dress with a white collar, sensible shoes, and her hair was pulled back in a practical bun. But it was her smile that struck Kaufmann most forcefully, a genuine expression of warmth that seemed to encompass not just her students, but also these enemy soldiers who had been brought to observe her classroom. "Good morning, class," Miss Henderson said, her voice clear and confident. "Today we have some very special visitors from Camp Algona. These gentlemen have come all the way from Germany, and while they're here in America, they're going to learn about how we do things. I want you all to make them feel welcome and show them what good students you are." 28 children, ranging in age from 10 to 12, turned in their seats to look at the German prisoners. Kaufmann had expected fear, perhaps hostility. These were children whose fathers, brothers, and uncles were fighting against Germany at that very moment. Some of these families had undoubtedly received telegrams informing them of casualties, yet nothing on the faces looking back at him showed curiosity rather than hatred, interest rather than fear. A small boy in the front row, his blonde hair sticking up in several directions, despite obvious attempts to comb it down, raised his hand eagerly. Miss Henderson nodded at him with an indulgent smile. "Yes, Tommy? Are they really from Germany? Can they understand English? Do they know my Uncle Frank is fighting in France right now?" Miss Henderson's expression grew gentle. "Some of them understand English, Tommy, and I'm sure they're thinking about their own families back home, just like you think about Uncle Frank. Now, let's show them how we start our day. Everyone, please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance." The children rose as one, their chairs scraping against the wooden floor in a reasonably synchronized movement. They placed their right hands over their hearts and turned toward an American flag hanging in the corner of the room. Kaufmann watched as these young Americans recited words about liberty and justice for all, their voices blending together in a ritual that was clearly familiar and meaningful to them. What struck Kaufmann was not the pledge itself, every nation had its patriotic rituals, but rather the atmosphere in which it was performed. There was no militaristic rigidity, no teacher barking commands or striking students who failed to stand straight enough. Miss Henderson simply stood with her own hand over her heart, a slight smile on her face as she watched her students participate in this daily ceremony. When they finished, the children sat down without being told, pulling out books and pencils from their desks with practiced efficiency. Unteroffizier Walter Schneider, standing next to Kaufmann, leaned over and whispered in German, "Look at how much space each child has." And did you see? Every single one has their own books. Not sharing, not waiting for the teacher to distribute materials, just their own books, sitting in their desks. Schneider was 31, older than most of the enlisted men, and had worked as an elementary school teacher in Hamburg before being conscripted in 1942. His perspective was different from the other prisoners. Where they saw simply another manifestation of American material abundance, Schneider recognized the pedagogical implications of what they were witnessing. Individual desks meant individual attention was possible. Personal books meant students could work at their own pace. The bright, cheerful environment suggested that education was valued not just as a duty, but as something to be enjoyed. Miss Henderson began the day's lessons with mathematics, and Kaufman watched in fascination as she wrote problems on a large blackboard at the front of the room. The blackboard itself was remarkable, clean and smooth, with no cracks or patches where the surface had worn away. Miss Henderson's chalk made clear, legible marks that could be easily read from the back of the room where the prisoner stood. But it was her teaching method that truly captured the attention of the German observers. Rather than simply lecturing while students copied notes, Miss Henderson asked questions. She called on students by name, encouraged them to come to the board and show their work, praised their efforts even when they made mistakes, and gently guided them toward correct answers without humiliation or harsh criticism. A girl named Susan was working through a long division problem at the board, her tongue sticking out slightly in concentration. She made an error in her calculation, and Kaufman tensed, expecting the sharp rebuke that would have been automatic in the German schools of his youth. Instead, Miss Henderson stepped forward and said gently, "That's a good try, Susan. You've got the right idea. But let's look at this step again. When you multiply 6 times 7, what do you get?" Susan's face cleared. "Oh, 42, not 44. "Exactly right. Now try the rest of the problem with that correction." Susan completed the problem successfully, and Miss Henderson led the class in a round of applause before sending the girl back to her seat with an encouraging pat on the shoulder. The child was beaming, clearly proud of herself despite having initially made a mistake. Gefreiter Hans Mueller, a former factory worker from Essen, muttered to his companions, "In my school, if you made a mistake at the board, the teacher would rap your knuckles with a ruler, sometimes worse. I was so afraid of being called on that I could barely think when the teacher looked in my direction." Several other prisoners nodded in agreement. The education they had received in Germany, particularly for working-class children, had been based on rote memorization, strict discipline, and corporal punishment for failure. The idea that a teacher would encourage a student who had made an error, would treat that error as a learning opportunity rather than a punishable offense, seemed almost revolutionary. After mathematics came a reading lesson, and here the abundance of American education became even more apparent. Miss Henderson distributed copies of a book to every student in the class. Not a shared text that would be passed around, not a single copy that the teacher would read from while students listened, but individual copies that each child could hold, follow along with, and take home if they wished. The book was a collection of American short stories, and Miss Henderson had chosen a tale by O. Henry for that day's lesson. She asked for volunteers to read aloud, and hands shot up throughout the classroom. She selected students who took turns reading passages, their voices clear and confident. When they encountered difficult words, Miss Henderson would pause the reading and discuss the meaning, writing the word on the blackboard and asking students to use it in their own sentences. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Kaufman noticed that not all the students read at the same level. Some stumbled over complex words, reading slowly and carefully. Others read with fluency and expression that suggested they had been reading for years. Yet Miss Henderson treated each student with the same encouragement and respect, never showing impatience with slower readers or allowing faster readers to dominate the lesson. Between subjects, Miss Henderson allowed the children a brief break. They were permitted to stand, stretch, visit the water fountain at the back of the room, or sharpen their pencils at a mechanical sharpener mounted on the wall. The prisoners watched in amazement as the children moved about freely, talking quietly among themselves, without any teacher having to maintain order through threats or punishment. The discipline was there, the children knew the boundaries and respected them, but it seemed to come from mutual respect rather than fear. When the bell rang for recess, Miss Henderson instructed the children to put on their coats and go outside for playtime. The prisoners were invited to observe from the school's back steps, and what they saw there continued to challenge their assumptions about American education. The playground was equipped with swings, slides, climbing bars, and seesaws, all in good repair. A large open area had been marked for various games, and Kaufman could see painted lines for hopscotch and other activities. But what struck him most was the variety of activities taking place simultaneously. Some children played organized games of kickball, others jumped rope, still others simply ran around expending energy. Several boys were engaged in an elaborate game that seemed to involve complex rules they had invented themselves. 2 teachers supervised the playground, but their supervision was minimal. They watched to ensure safety, intervening only when play became too rough or when a child was hurt. Otherwise, they allowed the children to organize their own activities, negotiate their own rules, and resolve their own minor conflicts. The freedom was remarkable, especially to German prisoners who had been raised in an educational system that emphasized conformity and obedience. "This is how they train them to think for themselves," Schneider observed quietly. "See how the children decide what to play, how they argue about the rules and come to agreements. They're learning democracy on this playground as surely as they learn reading in the classroom." Feldwebel Otto Richter, a career soldier who had joined the Wehrmacht in 1936, shook his head in disbelief. "But where is the discipline? Where is the order? If German children were allowed this much freedom, there would be chaos." Yet there was no chaos. Despite the apparent freedom, the playground functioned smoothly. Children who fell were helped up by their friends. Arguments were resolved through negotiation. When the bell rang to signal the end of recess, all the children lined up at the door without having to be rounded up or herded into formation. They had internalized the rules and expectations to such a degree that external enforcement was rarely necessary. Back in the classroom, the afternoon lessons included science and social studies. For science, Miss Henderson had prepared an experiment involving magnets and iron filings. Each student received their own small magnet and a piece of paper sprinkled with iron filings. They were instructed to place the magnet under the paper and observe the patterns that formed. The excitement in the room was palpable. Children exclaimed over the patterns they created, compared results with their neighbors, and asked questions about why the iron filings behaved as they did. Miss Henderson moved from desk to desk, looking at each child's experiment, asking questions that prompted them to think about what they were observing, and encouraging them to form their own hypotheses about magnetic forces. Every child has their own magnet, Kaufman thought in wonder. In Germany, the teacher would have one magnet, perhaps, and would demonstrate the experiment at the front of the class while students watched. The idea that every child in a class of 28 could have their own materials for hands-on learning seemed like an extravagance beyond comprehension. Yet it was clear that this was normal in American schools, at least in this town.
The children treated the magnets casually, as if having their own materials for experiments was nothing special. They focused on the learning, on the discovery, not on the privilege of having access to these educational tools. The social studies lesson that followed introduced the German prisoners to another aspect of American education that seemed remarkable. Miss Henderson had prepared a lesson on the westward expansion of the United States, and she began by unrolling a large map that showed the growth of the nation from the original 13 colonies to its present continental extent. But rather than simply lecturing about dates and territorial acquisitions, Miss Henderson engaged the students in a discussion about the motivations and experiences of the people who had moved west. She asked them to imagine what it would be like to leave their homes and travel across an unknown continent. She read them excerpts from diaries written by pioneers, including some written by children not much older than themselves. She encouraged them to think about the perspectives of different groups, the farmers seeking land, the miners seeking gold, and also the Native Americans whose lands were being taken. This last aspect particularly surprised the German observers. Miss Henderson did not present westward expansion as an unqualified triumph. She acknowledged that Native Americans had been displaced and mistreated. She asked her students to think about how those native peoples might have felt watching settlers take over their traditional lands. She was teaching her students to think, to question, to consider multiple viewpoints. She was training them not to blindly accept authority, but to evaluate information and form their own judgments based on evidence and reasoning. As the school day drew to a close, Miss Henderson had one final surprise for her German observers. She asked if any of the prisoners would be willing to speak to the class about Germany. The request was translated by Corporal James Mitchell, an American guard who spoke fluent German, having grown up in a German-speaking household in Wisconsin. The prisoners exchanged uncertain glances. What could they say to these American children? How could they bridge the vast gap between their experiences and the innocent curiosity of these young people? Finally, Schneider, the former teacher, stepped forward. His English was limited but functional, learned during his university studies before the war. He walked to the front of the classroom, acutely aware of his prison uniform, his worn boots, his status as an enemy soldier. Yet when he looked at the children's faces, he saw only interest and openness. They were curious about him, about his country, about his life. They were not afraid, and they were not hostile. They were simply children eager to learn about someone different from themselves. Schneider began by describing his hometown of Hamburg, the great port city on the Elbe River. He told them about the ships that came from all over the world, about the fish markets, about the distinctive architecture of the old city center. He described German schools, carefully avoiding any mention of Nazi ideology, focusing instead on the subjects he had taught and the students he had known. The American children asked questions. What games did German children play? What were German schools like? What was his favorite food? Did he miss his family? The questions were innocent, human, bridging the artificial divide created by war. Schneider answered as honestly as he could, and as he spoke, he felt something shifting inside himself. These American children were being taught to see the world in all its complexity, to understand that people in other countries were human beings with families, hopes, and dreams.
They were being given an education that would enable them to think critically, to question authority, to form their own opinions based on evidence and reasoning. They were being prepared not to be obedient subjects, but active citizens, capable of participating in democratic governance. The contrast with his own education, and with the education being provided to German children under the Nazi regime, could not have been more stark. German schools had become instruments of indoctrination, teaching children to obey without question, to accept Nazi ideology without examination, to see other peoples as inferior or threatening. The goal was to create soldiers and supporters of the regime, not independent thinkers. American schools, at least this one, had very different goals. They sought to create individuals capable of thinking for themselves, questioning authority, and participating actively in democratic society. The abundance of materials, the individual attention, the encouragement of critical thinking, all of these elements worked together to produce citizens rather than subjects. When the school day finally ended, the children filed out with cheerful goodbyes to Miss Henderson and curious glances at the German prisoners. Miss Henderson approached the group of Germans and, through Corporal Mitchell, asked if they had any questions about what they had observed. Schneider spoke for the group, his voice thoughtful. In Germany, we have always prided ourselves on our educational system. We believed German schools were the best in the world, training the most disciplined and knowledgeable students. But what I have seen today makes me question those assumptions. These children are learning to think, not just to memorize. They are learning to question, not just to obey. They are being treated as individuals with their own minds and capabilities, not as vessels to be filled with approved information. Miss Henderson smiled, a sad but understanding expression. Education should liberate the mind, not imprison it. These children will grow up to be citizens of a democracy, and democracy requires people who can think for themselves, evaluate information critically, and make informed choices. That's what we try to give them here. As the German prisoners were loaded back onto the truck that would return them to Camp Algona, Kaufman found himself looking back at Lincoln Elementary School. It was just one school in one small Iowa town, yet what he had witnessed there had shaken assumptions he had held his entire life. The abundance of materials was impressive, certainly, but it was the philosophy behind American education that truly struck him. Germany had prided itself on creating efficient workers and loyal soldiers through its educational system. America was creating something different, citizens capable of independent thought and democratic participation. The question that haunted Kaufman as the truck drove away was which approach would ultimately prove more successful and what kind of society each approach would create. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Iowa countryside as the truck carrying the German prisoners rumbled down the rural highway. Inside, the men sat in silence, each lost in his own thoughts about what they had witnessed. The silence was heavy with contemplation, rather than the usual exhaustion or boredom that characterized their returns from work details. The educational philosophy they had observed represented something fundamentally different from anything in their experience, a system built not on obedience and conformity, but on individual development and critical thinking. For men who had been raised in a culture that emphasized collective identity and submission to authority, the implications were profound and unsettling. The visits to American schools became a regular occurrence over the following months. Camp Algona's commandant, Colonel Robert Fitzgerald, believed that exposing German prisoners to American institutions would serve multiple purposes. It would occupy the prisoners constructively, provide them with insights into democratic society, and perhaps most importantly, demonstrate that America's strength came not just from industrial capacity, but from its investment in human development. 3 weeks after the initial visit to Lincoln Elementary, a different group of prisoners was transported to Roosevelt High School in Des Moines. Among them was Lieutenant Frederick Weber, a former university student who had been studying engineering in Berlin before being drafted in 1941. At 24, Weber was younger than many of the officers but older than most of the enlisted men. His incomplete education had left him with a hunger for knowledge that captivity had only intensified. Roosevelt High School was vastly larger than Lincoln Elementary, a 3-story brick building that occupied an entire city block. As the prisoners entered through the main doors, they found themselves in a wide hallway lined with metal lockers, bulletin boards covered with announcements about clubs and activities, and display cases showing trophies from various athletic and academic competitions. The sheer scale of the facility impressed Weber immediately. In Germany, secondary education was divided into different tracks based on testing and family background.
The gymnasium prepared students for university, while the Realschule and Hauptschule prepared others for technical careers or manual labor. This tracking began early, often by age 10, and largely determined a student's future opportunities. Roosevelt High School, however, served all students in its district regardless of background or academic ability. The American Guide, a teacher named Mr. Robert Patterson, explained through the interpreter that American high schools were comprehensive institutions designed to provide education to everyone, not just those deemed academically gifted or from privileged backgrounds. "We believe every young person deserves the opportunity to develop their full potential," Mr. Patterson said as he led the group through the building. "Some will go to college, others will learn trades, but all of them will be educated citizens capable of participating in democratic society." The prisoners were shown the school library first, and here the abundance that had characterized Lincoln Elementary reached new heights. Thousands of books lined the shelves, arranged by subject and author. Long wooden tables provided study space for dozens of students simultaneously. A card catalog system allowed students to locate any book in the collection. Several students were working at the tables, taking notes from reference books or writing essays. Weber approached one of the shelves and ran his fingers along the spines of the books. History, literature, science, mathematics, geography, philosophy. The variety was staggering.
He pulled out a physics textbook and flipped through it, noting the clear diagrams, the logical progression of concepts, the practice problems at the end of each chapter. This was a recent publication, printed just 2 years earlier. The information was current. The presentation was excellent. In Berlin, Weber had shared textbooks that were 15 or 20 years old, their pages yellowed and torn, their information increasingly outdated. The university library had better resources, but even there, books were scarce enough that students had to reserve them weeks in advance. The idea that a high school could have a library this extensive, with books available to any student who wanted them, seemed almost wasteful in its generosity. But Mr. Patterson explained that access to information was considered fundamental to democratic education. Students needed to be able to research topics independently, to compare different sources, to form their own conclusions based on evidence. The library was not a luxury, but a necessity, as essential to education as classrooms and teachers. The group moved on to observe actual classes, and Weber found himself standing at the back of a chemistry laboratory. 30 students, 15 pairs, were conducting experiments at individual lab stations. Each station had its own burners, beakers, test tubes, and chemical supplies. A teacher, Mrs. Eleanor Chen, circulated among the stations, answering questions and ensuring safe procedures were followed. Weber watched as students mixed solutions, heated compounds, and carefully recorded their observations in lab notebooks. They were learning by doing, not just by listening to lectures or reading about experiments. Each pair of students was engaged in active discovery, testing hypotheses and drawing conclusions from their own observations. The cost of providing this kind of hands-on education must be enormous, Weber thought. Every chemical, every piece of glassware, every burner represented an investment in student learning. In Germany, chemistry demonstrations were typically performed by the teacher at the front of the class, while students watched. Only university students in advanced courses had access to laboratory facilities, and even then, equipment and supplies were limited. Mrs. Chen noticed the German observers and walked over to speak with them through the interpreter. She explained that laboratory work was considered essential to science education. Students needed to understand not just the theories, but also the practical application and the methods of scientific investigation. This hands-on approach developed critical thinking skills and prepared students for potential careers in science and technology.
One of the student pairs, a boy and girl working together at their station, successfully completed their experiment and called Mrs. Chen over to verify their results. She examined their work, asked them questions about what they had observed and why certain reactions had occurred, then praised their careful methodology. The students beamed with pride as they cleaned their station and began writing up their findings. Obergefreiter Martin Keller, standing next to Weber, whispered in German, "Did you see that? Boys and girls working together, and the teacher treats them exactly the same. She asks them the same questions, expects the same level of work from both." Weber had noticed this as well. In German schools, even before the Nazi emphasis on separate gender roles, boys and girls were often segregated for many subjects, particularly sciences and mathematics. The assumption was that girls had different capabilities and would pursue different life paths. Here, no such distinction was made. Boys and girls studied the same subjects, performed the same experiments, and were held to the same standards. The next classroom they visited was an English literature class studying American poetry. The teacher, Mr. David Morrison, was leading a discussion of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. What struck Weber was not just the content, but the method of instruction. Mr. Morrison asked questions that had no single correct answer. He encouraged students to share their interpretations of Whitman's poems, to discuss what the words meant to them personally, to consider how Whitman's democratic ideals were reflected in his poetry. Students offered diverse opinions. Some found Whitman's celebration of individualism inspiring. Others were puzzled by his unconventional style. Still others connected his themes to contemporary American society and the war effort. Mr. Morrison listened to each perspective, asked follow-up questions, and encouraged students to support their interpretations with evidence from the text. He never declared any interpretation right or wrong, only more or less well supported by textual evidence. This method of teaching literature was entirely foreign to Weber's experience. In German schools, teachers presented the accepted interpretation of literary works. Students were expected to learn and reproduce these interpretations on examinations. The idea that multiple valid interpretations might exist, that students should form their own understanding of texts, seemed dangerously subjective. Yet Weber could see the pedagogical purpose. Students were learning to think independently, to support arguments with evidence, to respect differing viewpoints, and to engage in civil discourse. These were precisely the skills needed for democratic citizenship. Literature was not just about appreciating great writing, but about developing the capacity for nuanced thinking and reasoned debate. During the lunch period, the German prisoners were taken to the school cafeteria, and here they witnessed another manifestation of American educational philosophy. The cafeteria was a large, bright space with long tables and an efficient serving line. Students moved through the line, selecting from various options: hot meals, sandwiches, salads, milk, fruit, and desserts. The food was subsidized, making it affordable for all students, regardless of family income. Weber watched the easy interaction among students of apparently different social backgrounds. Children of factory workers sat with children of business owners. Recent immigrants sat with families whose ancestors had arrived on the Mayflower. There was no visible hierarchy, no segregation by class or status. The democratic principles America espoused were being lived out daily in this cafeteria.
Gefreiter Hans Zimmer, who had worked in his father's restaurant in Munich before the war, observed the cafeteria operations with professional interest. "Look at the efficiency," he murmured to Weber. "The serving line moves quickly, the food is hot and fresh, and there's almost no waste. They're feeding hundreds of students every day with the organization of a military operation." But what impressed Weber more than the efficiency was the underlying philosophy. In Germany, students typically brought their own lunches from home, and those from poor families often had inadequate nutrition. Here, America ensured that all students had access to proper meals, recognizing that hungry children could not learn effectively. Education was understood as requiring more than just teachers and textbooks. It required addressing the complete needs of the student. After lunch, the prisoners observed a civics class taught by Mr. Thomas Jefferson Williams, a teacher who had deliberately been given the middle name of America's third president. Mr. Williams was explaining the structure of American government, but rather than simply lecturing, he engaged students in a mock legislative session. Students had been divided into committees, each tasked with drafting a proposal on a local issue. They had to research their topics, write legislation, present their proposals to the full class, and then vote on whether to pass each measure. Weber watched in fascination as students debated a proposal to extend the school day by 30 minutes to allow for more extracurricular activities. Proponents argued that students would benefit from additional time for clubs and sports. Opponents argued that students already had too much homework and needed time for jobs or family responsibilities. The debate was spirited but civil, with students learning to make persuasive arguments, respond to opposing viewpoints, and ultimately accept the will of the majority when the vote was taken. This is how they train citizens for democracy, Weber realized, not through abstract lectures about government structure, but through actual practice in democratic procedures. These students are learning to propose ideas, build consensus, compromise when necessary, and accept outcomes they disagree with. They're being prepared to participate actively in civic life. The final stop on the tour was the school's vocational workshop, where students could learn practical skills like woodworking, metalworking, auto mechanics, and electrical work. This area of the school was equipped with tools and machinery that rivaled professional workshops. Students were building actual projects, furniture, mechanical devices, electrical circuits, under the supervision of skilled instructors. Mr. Patterson explained that American education recognized multiple forms of intelligence and multiple paths to success. Not every student would attend college, and that was perfectly acceptable. Those who preferred working with their hands could develop valuable skills that would provide good livelihoods. The key was ensuring that every student, regardless of their chosen path, received a quality education that prepared them for productive citizenship. Weber thought about the German educational system's rigid tracking, how decisions made when children were 10 years old largely determined their entire futures. Here, students had more flexibility, more opportunity to discover their interests and talents, more pathways to success. A student could change direction, pursue unexpected interests, and develop in ways that might not have been predicted by early testing. As the prisoners were loaded back onto the transport truck, Weber carried with him a growing understanding of why America had proven to be such a formidable adversary. It was not just industrial capacity or natural resources. It was the investment in human potential, the belief that every person deserved the opportunity to develop their capabilities, the commitment to creating an educated citizenry capable of independent thought and democratic participation. The weeks turned into months, and the German prisoners continued their visits to various educational institutions. They observed elementary schools in small towns and large cities. They visited technical colleges where students learned advanced manufacturing skills. They even toured the University of Iowa, where they saw young Americans, many of whom would soon be serving in uniform, pursuing higher education in fields ranging from medicine to engineering to philosophy. Each visit reinforced the same fundamental insights. American education was abundant, providing resources that seemed extravagant by German standards.
It was democratic, serving all students regardless of background. It was practical, connecting learning to real-world applications. And perhaps most importantly, it was liberating, designed to develop independent thinkers rather than obedient followers. The contrast with German education under the Nazi regime grew starker in the prisoners' minds. They remembered how textbooks had been rewritten to conform to Nazi ideology, how teachers who questioned approved curricula were dismissed or worse, how students were expected to join Hitler Youth and participate in indoctrination activities, how education had become a tool for creating conformity and obedience rather than developing individual potential. In the camp library, prisoners began seeking out books about American education and democratic theory. They read John Dewey's Democracy in Education, which articulated a philosophy of progressive education aimed at preparing active citizens for democratic society. They studied the history of American public schools, learning how education had been consciously designed to create an informed citizenry, capable of self-governance. Schneider, the former teacher from Hamburg, organized informal discussion groups where prisoners could process what they were observing. These sessions, held in the camp's recreation hall, attracted dozens of participants eager to make sense of their experiences. What we are seeing challenges everything we were taught about education and society, Schneider told one self-gathering. We believed that strict discipline and hierarchical authority were necessary for social order. We thought that allowing people to question and think independently would lead to chaos. But here we see a society that encourages questioning and independent thought. And it is not chaos we observe, but rather a different kind of order, one based on voluntary cooperation and shared democratic values. A young prisoner, barely 20 years old, raised his hand. But, Herr Schneider, without strict discipline, how do they maintain standards? How do they ensure students actually learn what they need to know? Schneider considered the question carefully. The discipline is there, but it comes from within rather than being imposed from without. The students we observed understand that education serves their own interests. They see that learning provides opportunities for better lives. The teachers create environments where students want to learn, where curiosity is rewarded rather than punished. This internal motivation proves more effective than external compulsion. The discussions often turn to the question of what would happen after the war. Germany would need to rebuild not just its cities and infrastructure, but also its educational system and social institutions. What lessons from American education could or should be applied to post-war Germany? How could German respect for scholarship and systematic thinking be combined with American emphasis on democracy and individual development? These were not abstract questions for the prisoners. Many of them would return to Germany after the war and would play roles in Reconstruction. Some, like Schneider, would return to teaching.
Others would enter business or government. The insights they were gaining about alternative approaches to education and social organization would influence their post-war choices and actions. As winter deepened over Iowa, the prisoners found themselves in an unexpected position. They were enemy soldiers, held captive in a foreign land. Yet they were being given opportunities to learn and grow that exceeded anything they had known as free men in Germany. The paradox was not lost on them. In captivity, they were freer intellectually and spiritually than they had been in Nazi Germany. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.